so pleased that you're here with us as Robert Williams, Afridi, Mark Weitzman, Jim Wald, and our moderator, Barbara Fugita-Brill, talk to us about the Routledge history of anti-Semitism. In preparation for the brief Q&A that's going to follow their conversation, please use the note cards that we handed out to write your questions on. You can flag me or our intern in the back down if you still need one, and we will be collecting your questions at the end of the conversation. We also hope that you'll enjoy the other events that are part of the book festival, including our Family Day next Sunday the 19th, and the museum's events that take place regularly, which you can find at mjhnyc.org/events. We are so grateful that the book festival is made possible in part by support from the Battery Park City Authority and to our partner in this talk, the USC Shoah Foundation. Your support also sustains our educational program. So if I told you about all of our panelists' accomplishments and specialties, we would be here for a very, very long time. But I'm going to do my best to give you the highlights and then let them speak for themselves. So Dr. Afridi is an award-winning author, professor of religious studies, and director of the Holocaust Genocide and Interfaith Education Center at Mehnaz College. She teaches courses on Islam, the Holocaust, genocide, comparative religion, and feminism. Dr. Williams is the Finchie Vitterby Executive Director of the University of Southern California Shoah Foundation. In addition, he is an advisor to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, UNESCO Chair on Genocide Education, and on the steering committee of the German and U.S. government-funded Global Task Force Against Holocaust Distortion. His research specialties include German history, U.S. and Russian foreign policy, propaganda and disinformation, and contemporary anti-Semitism. Mark Weitzman is Chief Operating Officer for the World Jewish Restitution Organization, which advocates and pursues a measure of justice for Holocaust survivors, their families, and Jewish communities. He is a member of the official U.S. delegation to the International Holocaust Remembrance Authority, where he chaired the Committee on Antisemitism and Holocaust Denial, and is currently chairing the Working Group on Holocaust Museums and Memorials. In 2019, he was invited to be one of the founding board members of the International Organization of Antisemitism Research, the first academic society for the interdisciplinary study of antisemitism. James Wald teaches history at Hampshire College in Amherst, Massachusetts, with specialties in modern European cultural history, Nazism and anti-Semitic and racist ideologies, and historic preservation. He also teaches history and memory in Prague and Krakow and has research topics in anti-Semitism related to the survival of Christian supersessionist thinking in secular modernity, the evolution of the Kaiser myth, and anti-Semitism in the Polish army in exile in Britain during the Second World War. Our moderator, Barbara Fugita-Brill, is a television executive, media consultant, and award-winning journalist. She's the founder and principal of Casablanca Strategy Group, an advisory firm serving media and business clients. Barbara has been on the Hollywood Reporter's list of most powerful people in New York media and Variety's Power of Women lists. She's won the Peabody, DuPont, Emmy, and Murrow Awards. Barbara sits on the board of Urban Garage, is an advisor to National Dance Institute and San Angelo News, and hold for fact. Served as a trustee of Central Synagogue for nearly a decade. She lives in New York with her husband and 3 children. So now please welcome our panelists, and I'm going to turn things over to you.
So we're going to start by having each one of our esteemed panelists tell us how their life and their everyday work has changed since October 7th.
Hello. Wow, that's a big question in a very strange manner because we're still kind of going through it. I'm still in that place. So for me, I'm a Muslim that teaches the Holocaust and been working against anti-Semitism, against Islamophobia, against hate, against Black racism. But I also am someone who is fearful of how much hate, especially anti-Semitism, has grown in this country and elsewhere in Western Europe, but also the Muslim and Arab world. And one of the things that changed for me on 2 different ways. One is my fear of my personal safety, my family's safety in terms of what I do and who I am, And two is, how do I navigate this in the best way possible as an academic, a scholar, but also a director? How do I do my programs? How is this going to happen now? And the way that I feel that our campus, Manhattan College is a Catholic school, has been calm, peaceful. I'm also the Muslim student advisor on that campus. So there's a lot of layers of why we're seeing anti-Semitism, but how my life changed after October 7th. And so I'm in the midst of a lot of phone calls with very, very nice people, mainly Jewish and also some non-Jewish leaders that are asking me, can you please come here and help us out? So I think it's a moment in time, honestly, was not waiting for. It was always a dangerous line for me to walk, in a sense, but it's become more dangerous because I have to seriously think about the safety of the ones that I love.
So, as a trained historian, I'm supposed to avoid those cliches that the past echoes, or those who don't know the past or to repeat it. And the past has become very real to me, but not just since October 7th. And the first inkling of this was on January 6th, where if you study how perpetrators carried out the Holocaust, how the people of a democratic society can become radicalized like that. You know, many of us saw that in action, so that was on the perpetrator's side. What we've seen since October 7th is the other pole, that being the victim side. We've seen in the wake of a horrific anti-Semitic attack the rise of local anti-Semitism. And this is the thing that is shocking, actually, for me, because we know that after the Kishinev pogrom of the early 20th century, that there was a brief moment where American society began to really become concerned about the fate of East European Jewry. That moment led to the creation of, among other things, the organization that became the ADL. We know that after the Shoah, the West became aware of these crimes, aware of the dangers of anti-Semitism, realized that anti-Semitism was inimical, can't think of a better word, apologies, to a healthy democracy, and it didn't matter. Doesn't seem to have mattered yet, right? In France, there have been more than 12,250 anti-Semitic attacks since October 7th. In the city of London, the rates of anti-Semitism have increased almost 1,300%. We've learned from the past and it hasn't changed anything. This tells me that I have two responsibilities. One responsibility is to begin addressing the subject in a way that prioritizes the experiences of those who are victimized by anti-Semitism. Stop looking at how the perpetrators acted and trying to change the rest of society through that lens, and start trying to build the awareness and understanding that can lead to more compassion, for lack of a better term. The other challenge is how to convince other non-Jews like me that this actually matters. And that's been the hardest part. A couple friends on this dais, a couple friends in the audience, I've asked the question, what would you like non-Jews to know? And I hear a couple of different answers to that question, but I haven't quite figured out how to activate that switch for non-Jews to become aware of the dangers of anti-Semitism. And we have a lot more work to do on that front in particular.
So for me, I think it is difficult to answer that question without going into sort of a few parts of my own identity. So in a professional sense, I run an organization that deals with trying to get justice and restitution for Holocaust survivors and making sure that what happened then is not distorted, not lost, and particularly in the countries that were former communist countries, Eastern Europe, 15, 16, 17 different countries. genocide, and crimes, that we're still trying to help provide for them. And that responsibility is still on us, but how do we do that in a world where the sound bite, the latest news cycle is what dominates? The second part is, I guess in a sense, at least my scholarly work, which is also trained as a historian, and has dealt with both anti-Semitism and extremism in different forms. And here I'm seeing all sorts of things that underpin a lot of what we took for granted. We use the expression, for example, of American exceptionalism, that the United States was an exception to the history of anti-Semitism in other countries. We didn't have organized drums. We didn't have a state religion that kept other religions, especially Jews, out of positions of power or authorized forced conversion or things of that nature. We had escaped, we thought, the worst of what was happening in the rest of the world. The events of October 7th have called that into question. Seeds were planted earlier. Rob rightfully referred to January 6th. If you all remember, the fellow in the storming of the Capitol was wearing the Camp Auschwitz t-shirt, for example. So we saw harbingers from that perspective. But the amount, particularly in elite circles, the amount of downright hostility and anti-Semitism, that it's not necessarily sent to the level of crime, but it comes out in attitudes, it comes out in spoken language, it comes out in all sorts of non-criminal measures and ways. In a blind, unthinking, illogical paroxysm of hatred has been overwhelming and calls into question the entire, basically, body of scholarship that dealt with American anti-Semitism previously. And the last part that I'll say, so obviously you can all go in greater depth and detail about that. The last part I'm going to say is very personal in a sense, because as a practicing Jew, I can tell you that my community has been shaken and unmoored, totally cut off from whatever certainty that existed beforehand. People who've been here, families have been here for 3-4 generations, are now questioning their future here, their children's future here, questioning their own safety, questioning whether they can go to synagogue, whether their kids can go to school, whether universities are the right place for them. There are Jewish schools that are now telling certain campuses, certain university recruiters don't show up because you have not been able to guarantee the safety of our graduates. So we are not interested in sending them to be exposed to danger and harm on your campus. The cowardice and the lack of intellectual and moral clarity in our elite institutions has been nothing less than just, I don't even know how to describe it, other than just an eye-opener. And it's something that, again, leaves a body of people who have contributed a great deal to this society and this culture, personally scared, and personally wondering what future they have in this country.
Another historian here. On October 6th, I was taking part in a panel at the German Studies Association in Montreal about the place of anti-Semitism in German history. And part of what I said had to do with a contemporary situation in which the head of the Office of the Protection of the Constitution, which deals with terrorism, security, racism, and so forth, had said that anti-Semitism was on the rise and had begun to seep even to middle-class respectable circles. And I said, this is cause for concern, but I'm not alarmed. Then we all woke up the next morning to the news and we had a very somber dinner that night as the panel was discussing what we were seeing. To echo Rob's point, maybe it's because I'm invariably ironic and pessimistic because of the kind of things I study, but I tend to doubt that people really learn from history. And that's maybe one of the most disappointing things about this. Darrell Horn wrote a book called People That Ever Left Dead Jews, a concept she didn't invent. And obviously that's not even true. I think sympathy for Jewish suffering will have an expiration date of about 3 to 7 days. So what was really disturbing for me, I'd like to say I'm shocked but not surprised by the things I see, is the way things flipped so suddenly. That first there was sympathy for the victims of this mass attack, the worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust. And thereupon, when there were pogroms in Poland after World War II, and 50, 70 Jews were killed, a dozen, a few dozen, this shocked the world, populations left and so forth. Here we're talking about a massive number in the context of both Jewish history and the population of the state of Israel. And there was some kind of outpouring of sentiment, but very soon that flipped over. And I think what's most disappointing to me, among several things, is that people don't seem to have the head and heart, the capacity in head and heart to feel compassion for innocent victims on both sides. It's all become just one side or the other, with some exceptions in the press coverage. And I see this in the same way that others here have mentioned, but above all in progressive circles and academic circles. You know, we used to think it was a case in a place like England. England had a problem with the Labour Party and so forth, and that whole movement. But here, we see it in ways that are most inexplicable, I think. Not that people have to be pro-Israel or anti-Israel, but the way that one narrative somehow captured the entire attention of academia, the way students and faculty brushed this on one-sided statements, not realizing that anti-Semitism possibly involved these things. For example, when students for justice in Palestine praised these attacks on October 7th as an act of resistance and liberation, other groups were able to condemn it and strike a more complicated view. So there's that. And the idea that now people are questioning the evidence, two things. They're questioning the evidence for what happened on October 7th, and they're questioning the validity of Jewish complaints. In Britain, for example, under the Equality Act, there's something called the McPherson principle. This goes back to a case in which a young black man was murdered. But the basic idea about dealing with the suspicion of hate crime and discrimination in Britain is that you are first obligated to take seriously what the complainant says. If someone says, I was a victim of racism, it doesn't mean it's automatically true, but you have to take it seriously, you have to investigate. And here we see people saying, which again we've seen in Britain, because the forerunner, that Jews lodge charges of anti-Semitism cynically with the idea of closing down discourse on opposing points of view. And so I think also we're in a very dark place. And whereas people talk about moving to France or moving to Britain, now, as Mark said, they're talking about moving to the US. It's a strange place to be.
I want to add a slightly positive outcome. I only say slightly. So Mark and I have been working together back when I had all my hair.
Only one thing.
And we've both been arguing in these international fora, whether it's at UNESCO or the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe or the Council of Europe, that Holocaust education is not the panacea that everybody seems to think it is. We both work in international fora with a number of diplomats, and every time a diplomat is confronted about anti-Semitism in her or his country, they stand up and say, we have mandatory Holocaust education. Job done. Clearly that hasn't been enough. And the positive spin on this is people are waking up to that reality. They're waking up to the fact that the Holocaust may be the most extreme and tragic manifestation of violent anti-Semitism. But it's not the only one. 100,000 Jews were murdered between 1917 and 1921 in Ukraine alone. Everybody forgot about it. Because we focused on 4 tragic years of our shared international history. We need to continue focusing on those years. I don't want to say set the Holocaust aside. The Holocaust is essentially, remember the Holocaust was initiated by a country that had been democratic. But you also need to remember it is 4 years and about 2,300 years of the history of anti-Semitism. I start with Greco-Egyptians. You can go back to Babylon if you want, but I couldn't figure out that language. The fact of the matter is you need to understand anti-Semitism as part of a continuum. It is not just something that emerges from the extreme right. It is not just something that comes through a racist lens. As we are seeing today, it takes on all forms. It comes from all sides of the political and ideological aisles. So the positive outcome, perhaps, is that people's eyes are starting to open to this form. Now, how we counter it is something else entirely.
So that's a good way to get into the book, right? You guys wrote this book. Tell us how it came together and what was the genesis of it and how did you put it all together?
think what happened was that this is an idea that had been sort of stewing in a couple of our minds for a while and came together, that realizing that there was really nothing that was both comprehensive and accessible in a way in the field. There were some, magnificent studies by major figures, or Bistrick, or Leon Polyakov going back, 50, 60 years, etc. But they were massive and hard to locate specific instances of them, or they were, kind of had a certain bent or agenda that took it in a different direction. And most of them had been done prior to the advent of technology, the growth of the internet, certainly before social media, essentially. And so we saw kind of a vacuum there. So the idea was to create a volume that had chapters that are both scholarly, with scholarship, and yet accessible. And we wanted to do it in a way that would encompass a range, that would make it also useful and practical as a teaching tool in universities, graduate schools, as well as for the average educated layperson. And so we came up with the idea of approaching leading scholars in the field, and we broke it down into 3 different sections. The first one being the chronological survey, different medieval, modern, ancient, etc. The second being geographical, by country generally, and we included areas and regions that had not been dealt with before usually, from Australia to South Africa to Central and Latin America, North Africa, country, places that really had been kind of off the map when it came to anti-Semitism studies. And finally, the section, the topical section, which included things both as Mehnaz's contribution on Muslim anti-Semitism, Christian anti-Semitism, my chapters in the Holocaust and distortion, Rob did on COVID virus, and sort of the approach of through a history of anti-Semitism as a kind of targeting Jews as purveyors of virus. Jim's chapter on Germany was geographical range. And the last part of it was that we wanted as well a couple of chapters at the end, which also sets the book apart, Black apart in a way that I think differs very much from its predecessors. A couple of chapters on Jewish reactions. We didn't want it to be another work that studied the actions of anti-Semites and that Jews as kind of this blank cipher that anti-Semites acted on, and the Jews were just sort of, the subject of the experiment, of the action. So we had a couple of chapters on religious responses to anti-Semitism, on Zionism as a political response to anti-Semitism. Again, to frame that this was happening to real people, and that there was a reaction, and that Jews are not passive actors in someone else's drama, but really individuals or a group with an identity and a culture and a life, inner life, and public life of their own.
And you guys worked with the accepted or approved definition of anti-Semitism. Can you walk us through and explain to us what that is?
We could flip the point.
Exactly.
So Mark and I are both very closely associated with what is known as the non-legally binding working definition of anti-Semitism of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which is a really long business card. This is a working definition that, thanks to Mark's efforts, passed through the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance in 2016. It has since been adopted by about 44 countries, if I'm not mistaken, at this point. A couple thousand businesses, multiple sports leagues. It's been endorsed by the Secretary General of the UN before he began contextualizing anti-Semitic attacks. And the European Union uses it as its accepted definition as well, and the Organization of American States. At its core, the definition states that anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as, I just lost the microphone, which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. It references rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism. It notes that the victims of anti-Semitism need not always be Jewish. So I'll give you an example of this in action. In 2009, the first major anti-Semitic incident that I was involved in happened at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum when I was working there, where a neo-Nazi came to our front door, pulled out a rifle, opened fire, murdered one of our guards, Stephen Tyrone Johns. Mr. Johns was not Jewish, but he was a victim of anti-Semitism. Now, the definition itself is worth reading, but it's two very brief, somewhat vague sentences. But it's important because it essentially says that anti-Semitism, now I have too much microphone. Anti-Semitism manifests in certain ways, which is important because it doesn't say who is an anti-Semite, it doesn't even define who is a Jew. Instead, it just says anti-Semitism appears. And this is important because it allows for an educational discussion around anti-Semitism. To say that picture that's up on that wall or that statement that your father just said, that might be problematic, and you can have a discussion about it. But these two sentences also come with a downside, kind of vague. So the definition also includes 11 examples of anti-Semitism that were vetted, and approved by consensus by several hundred diplomats and subject matter experts. And they range from the religious forms of anti-Semitism, to the racist forms of anti-Semitism, to the Israel-facing forms of anti-Semitism. So they really run the gamut. And that is the last point that I need to make. At times, people have seen the IRA definition as a silver bullet to kill the werewolf of anti-Semitism. It's not. At the end of the day, the IRA definition is just a flashlight. It can shine a light where anti-Semitism might exist, but it is not a perfect tool to use in every case. And I've just lost the mic again. So it's the first step on a longer path to fighting anti-Semitism. I don't know if Mark wants to add.
Yeah, there are a couple things to add to it. First of all, it's called a working definition of anti-Semitism, not because it's a work in progress, but because it's meant as a practical definition, a definition that people can use in the field, people who are not experts on anti-Semitism, if they're confronted with it or not sure where to fit it in, whether something whether it applies or doesn't apply. So it's really meant on a very practical level. And we also say very specifically a couple of very important things. We don't address Zionism. The word Zionism does not appear in the definition at all. We're not interested in ideology. We're interested in actions. Each of the examples was a specific concrete action. We say very clearly that criticism of Israel, like any other democratic country, is legitimate as long as it doesn't cross over what Mehnaz tries to call one of the 3Ds, which is demonization, delegitimization, or a double standard. But if you're criticizing Israel, you would criticize any other country, whether it's Iran or whether it's the United States, then that's not anti-Semitic. And we also say very specifically that context matters. Contextualizing the statement is very important. There are things that apply in different ways at different times, and it's not a kind of a box that something fits in so rigidly. So with all those precautions, nonetheless, it has become the whoopee boy for certain circles who claim that it's being used to shut down discourse on Israel or Zionism, etc. Either they haven't read it or they have refused to read it with an open mind. And so what happened is that, for example, in the United States, it was endorsed originally by the State Department and put on their website. It said this is what the State Department uses and encourages all our allies to use it. Then President Trump, in an executive order, applied it to the Department of Education in a very narrowly framed way, essentially saying that only that should be used to see if the complaint is anti-Semitic, because if it is, then it falls into a different category, protected categories of individuals on campus, and so the initial judgment has to be made whether it's anti-Semitic or not, and this is the metric to use for that. That was it. President Biden has reaffirmed that. It's one of the few executive orders that they did not roll back, and he has reaffirmed his support and his administration's support for the definition numerous times. That's the political background. When it came to the volume, and this is probably where we should have gotten to, and applying it, even though we were very much identified with it as the originators of it or the formal spokesperson on it, we realized that the volume represents an academic work. And in the academic field, there are differing definitions. Some much larger, some that we agree with or don't agree with this more, but we're not talking about the same practical use of the working definition. So we left space, even though it was the basic definition we agreed, and we have a few sentences about this in the introduction, that would be the framework for the volume. If an individual author really wanted to prefer a different definition, was identified with a different definition, fine. As scholars, we welcome the discourse on it, and we welcome the chance to exchange views and to be open about it and hopefully model a constructive dialogue about what anti-Semitism is in an arena that's become so heavily politicized at this time.
Can I have a word with that? My colleagues will correct me if I'm wrong. You know, what's important, I think, also is that this goes back like 20 plus years, right?
Well,
Yeah, but there was a document called the EUMC working definition. No, I mean, so I think there's something connected to it in that people needed a tool because people don't usually act like Nazis or the KKK and say the kind of things that are classically anti-Semitic in that sense. And the problem was that there were charges that incidents taking place were anti-Semitic, and that's why, as I understand, the working definition was developed as a guideline. And the other thing is the context. What was the context? It was attacks on Jews, in part arising in the year of the Second Intifada and hostility to Israel. And so that's the examples came out of historical context, is what I was saying.
So I can illustrate that very specific, very quickly. There was a classic example in Germany in 2009 where, in the previous Gaza war, there was firebombing, attempted arson of a synagogue in a small city in Germany, which was, a synagogue that was really destroyed in late 1930s, 1938, 39, rebuilt, very small Jewish population, Molotov cocktails were hurled, the people who perpetrated were arrested. They claimed that they were doing it in reprisal for Israel's actions in Gaza at that time. 2 German courts refused to call that a hate crime. They called it protected political speech. And that was essentially rejected by Germany, which is one of the recent spurs that led Germany to adopt the definition. But it's a classic example that we can use where firebombing a religious institution with people who have nothing to do with an activity thousands of miles away can be considered political speech when it comes to Jews. And in any other circumstances would be considered a hate crime. And that's the example, in a sense, that we use to illustrate the necessity for the definition and what it was taken from.
So, thank you, Mark. I want to say 2 very important things. And I am a member of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and the first Muslim member on there.
Somebody from Belgium.
Okay, yeah. So I feel that there's been a lot of pushback just because I'm on that alliance because of the definition. So let me say 2 things. One is you can indeed criticize Israel. You can. There is no reason that you cannot. Like you would criticize the United States, like you would criticize Iran or Libya or Egypt or China or any countries that we see being criticized politically. But here's the problem, though. When you criticize Israel, it's really important, like you would criticize America where we sit, is to say, okay, well, I'm not going to destroy all of the United States. But, I have a problem with their policy on abortion. Something in my state, something that becomes problematic. That's really important. I mean, I don't think people understand that. I think I have criticized Israel. I'm sure my colleagues have heard that in the past. But nobody's going, oh, Mehnaz is anti-Semitic. Now, anti-Semitism is also important for those who are not Jews. This is going back to Rob's earlier point. Because every time there's an anti-Semitic act, right behind me is Islamophobia. Right behind me is black racism. Don't forget that anti-Semitism killed more than 6 million Jews, right? We're talking about people who were not in the fold of the mainstream during the Holocaust, right? So you have Roma Sinti, you have Muslims who were killed, you have Christians, Catholics, Protestants, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, who can go on and on. That has to be very clear. That anti-Semitism is dangerous, not just because it's horrible for Jews globally, but it's horrible for everybody. Therefore, when you are watching a protest in the streets of New York City or in London with 300,000 people, pro-Palestine, okay, fine, there's nothing wrong with being pro-Palestine, I'm pro-Palestine. The problem with those protests is that they're protests that have pockets of destroy Israel and using the Nazi swastika to equate it with the Jewish star. They have protests that want to burn the Israeli flag and they want to destroy Jewish people. I can't join that protest. I wish I could, because I care about the people of Gaza. So you have to be really intelligent and look at, first of all, and I know a lot of people here are young and some of them my students, what are you being fed? What kind of propaganda? The classroom or this forum is not a place for propaganda. It's a place where intelligent people can speak to you, even if you have questions that might offend someone. Those are the spaces we need in the United States and everywhere. So, I mean, for example, I have some students who ask me, is Israel an apartheid state? I can respond to that question intelligently, right? Or, you know, are all Palestinians terrorists? This conversation is not out there in terms of education. And this is where I think we have a vital crisis in terms of dialogue, and we're going to just become more and more polarized.
So I'm going to say, no, it's not. So, now I want to actually tag on this because Mehnaz is raising several very important points. This is where I think the book has a particular value. A couple of my colleagues have heard me say this before, but you know, I don't only believe, I know that anti-Semitism, or Jew hatred, is one of the original sins of Western civilization. It's intrinsic throughout much of our Western culture. Mark has done separate research on this. It's definitely worth reading. But it's always there. It's even in some of the coverage we're seeing of the war today. You know, this notion that the Jewish people target children is not new. This is about 800-900 years old. It's a trope that repeats over and over and over again, and it informs the way we see these conflicts. Anti-Jewish sentiment also creeps into otherwise, as Mehnaz was saying, otherwise legitimate topics of discourse. How much of the Israeli population was protesting the current Israeli government before the war started? I would receive requests to sign petitions. I am a big democracy backer. Right? My family's lived in this country way too long, and then you'll know how like I really am. So I'm not even going to tell you. We've lived here a very long time. We love democracy. So I'm asked to sign these petitions, and I will not sign these petitions because they will repeat the apartheid trope, or they will repeat the trope of white settler colonialism, which if you know anything about Israel, you know is not true because it's actually not a white country. That it'll repeat these lies about Jewish control, these lies about Jewish desires to murder children in particular. These lies repeat over and over again in what could otherwise be very legitimate discussions worth having. But they become infused with an almost unconscious anti-Semitism to such an extent that it's difficult for those of us who do care about social justice, who do care about human rights, to sign on.
So let's talk about the nuance in that, right? That's the word that everybody keeps using, right? Anti-Semitism versus other forms of hatred. Jim, why don't you?
I was going to address the previous one. Just to echo what Rob is saying, I want to make clear, we're not talking about some kind of linear progression that doesn't change. We're not talking about some timeless hatred that's just always out there. But what we're saying is that, exactly as Rob said, anti-Semitism is a feature of a Western civilization. And as a result, there are certain ways of thinking that are so deeply, about Jews, that are so deeply ingrained that most people can't see them. That's part of the definitions too. You know, you think about what goes back to Christianity, right? You have the vengeful Old Testament God versus the New Testament God of love and faith and so forth. All these kind of binaries and so forth. They're really deeply anchored, and so part of our job here is to try to expose them. You know, David Kurtz, a great historian of Italian Jewry and papacy, says in the foreword that there's really not much very original in today's anti-Semitism. In other words, it can survive and succeed because it can draw on deep strains that we don't even realize are in our thinking, in our culture, and so forth. So part of our is to try to articulate those things in the book and show them how they work over time.
I think to add to that a little bit is that what Mehnaz was essentially saying, I think I would boil it down to, that anti-Semitism is always a negative philosophy. It is not a constructive philosophy at all. Anti-Semitism leads only to destruction and death. Not just to Jews, but to the society in which it undermines and takes control. If you want to get something constructive done, which includes constructive criticism of a country or an ideology or whatever, you have to reject anti-Semitism. They can't go hand in hand together. One of the things that we try to do in the volume, I mentioned earlier, in terms of breaking it down and making it highly accessible by these chapters and topics and things, is that if given that we've all agreed that anti-Semitism is structural to Western culture and civilization, and many places of the world, not just the Western world, obviously, we're seeing it in parts of the Middle East and other places as well, including in China today, a country that has never had a significant Jewish population. If we agree to that, then it can become overwhelming to look at. And by breaking it down the way we did, again, I'll use the word, we try to make it much more accessible. If you're interested in anti-Semitism in Germany or in Spain or in North Africa, there are specific chapters on that. If you're interested in anti-Semitism in art, for example, or on the internet, or in terms of gender discourse, there are chapters on that. And by doing that, we hope that you can use different points of interest to enter into the conversation about anti-Semitism, to get a basis of knowledge of it. And part of the thing that we also know from our own work and experience is that a lot of people talk about anti-Semitism, sometimes with very little knowledge of what it really is. And that was also a gap that we were hoping to fill.
So, you know, I want to make another comment, which is something really important for us Americans. What's going on in terms of campuses? What's going on in terms of the streets, in synagogues, in mosques, in schools, is that we've forgotten that we have religious freedom. And it's something perhaps a lot of you, I mean, I don't know where you're from, where you came, when you came. I'm actually an immigrant to this country, but I'm very much American. I feel that we tend to forget that the United States, and I'm saying this as someone who has lived in Western Europe, lived in the Middle East, lived in places like Luxembourg, right? I really believe that this is the only country that has religious freedom and that we are protected. And that this is something that is not even a conversation anymore in the public. I want you to reflect on that, because if there is religious freedom, we're definitely not protecting it. And there's something that has gone awry. And if you want to hold on to your civil liberties, this is the approach I would take. That we are Americans and we don't tolerate anti-Semitism, we don't tolerate Islamophobia, we don't tolerate anti-Hindu sentiment, anti-Buddhist sentiment, anti-Christian sentiment. That we have religious freedom and we hold on to that, because you know what, if you live in another country, you're not going to find it, you just don't. So I want us to think about this as a way to be more optimistic and positive about what you actually have, right? Than be threatened by a few people. I think that's super important. And to sort of bring it back home, where the Statue of Liberty is, right? To talk about that religious freedom and to really understand that we must not lose this as Americans together. And if we let that anti-Semitism go on, or Islamophobia, or anti-Israel, anti-Palestinian sentiment on our campuses, we are going to lose our future. So this is vital, it's important, educate yourself, but also think about what you have, what you can build on, rather than breaking it up. I am still working with my Jewish friends, I'm still working with my Christian friends, I'm still working with a few Muslims. I'm not backing down. We have done great work in the United States. We must continue our work. This is not the time to break our solidarity. And that's my message.
So who are the allies in this fight? Who are the people that we can look to? And
See two of them sitting right here.
Yeah.
From different perspectives. And I have to say at a personal level that I've known both Mehnaz and Wald for a long time. And probably never said this publicly, how much I appreciate their personal commitment and investment at great risk in many ways, both professionally and personally, on the subject. And without allies, we would not be, we would be on the endangered species list, basically. So I think one of it is to really acknowledge the allies that we have. I sometimes am asked, if there's anything encouraging, so I'll share my optimistic perspective, which is going to be a bit bizarre, because it begins in Washington, in Congress of all places. And I may be the only person in the United States right now to use optimism in Congress in the same sentence. But there are in both the Senate and the House task forces on anti-Semitism, and they're bipartisan. And they're possibly the only thing left in Washington that has significant bipartisan support. And they're not huge numbers, and they're people who probably would never agree with each other on any other issue, but they exist, they've been nurtured, they've managed to continue over the past decade or so. There have been changes in leadership as people left office and so on. They're still there, I was just in Washington a week ago, meeting with them and so on. And if in the middle of a fractured world in Washington, we know the political situation, and we know the political divide, and if you can find allies on both sides of the aisle who are open to calling out their own side first before pointing fingers at the other side and maintain a working relationship, to me that's really encouraging, and that's the kind of effort that we need. And I really applaud them for that. I hope that we're aware of it and that we support those efforts as well.
Could I throw a word of warning out, though? On this issue of allies, allies are very, very important. I don't want to minimize that. I think activating potential allies is a huge challenge that we have. But this is not the only moment when Jews in the diaspora or the people of Israel have been under attack. And there have been tendencies in the past to seek any ally that comes calling. Even if those allies are illiberal states, be they in Europe or other parts of the world, or people who have a particular agenda that may not be in the long-term best interests of the Jewish people. So as we try to seek allies, my advice would be try to seek allies who don't see the world a binary black or white way. Find people who are capable of nuance, something that is extremely difficult today. But it's not an either-or proposition. I had a conversation with a student on campus at USC on last Wednesday. We had a solidarity event for Jewish students that day. This student came up to me, relayed his personal experience, and said, and we need to fight the left. We need to find allies on the right, and we need to take down the left. 40 years ago, the conversation would have been, we need to take down the right. We need to find allies on the left. Find allies on both sides. Find allies among the religious. Find allies among the non-religious. Don't look for one category. Look for people who are capable of seeing you through. are or who your community is. It's a very dangerous moment. If you throw your lot in with those who only have one interest among your many interests, you're going to be in trouble in the long term.
Can you both share with us your thoughts about media coverage as it relates to all of this?
I'll start since I wrote a dissertation about media and anti-Semitism. You know, it's always been very, very difficult. After the Second World War, the country that had formerly been known as Germany was occupied by 4 countries. Each of those 4 countries had their own media operations. Each tried to deal with the reality of the Holocaust in different ways. And it essentially led to those in what became East Germany saying that the capitalists were responsible for the Holocaust, and those in West Germany saying Holocaust, what Holocaust, we need to fight the communists. You need to realize that the media has different lenses. There are issues of media freedom in Israel that I was just reading about today. There are issues of the media in parts of the United Kingdom viewing this through a very, very biased lens, focusing only on immediate reports that are coming from, we'll be generous and say Hamas-affiliated news outlets. Probably not the most unimpeachable source. The solution seems to be to do what some of us still have to do every day, even if we don't have time. We need lots of newspapers of different hues. The more languages, the better. And maybe you'll find something in between the lines that gets you closer to where you need to be. More than that, though, and this is why the work of the USC Shoah Foundation is so important. Listen to the people who are actually affected by these events. Don't go through the mediatic events. Go to the people who survived, the people who witnessed, the people who experienced these atrocities. That's why we are taking these testimonies at the end of the day. Those who lived it know this better than anybody else, certainly better than somebody sitting in a studio 6,000 miles away.
So we live in a very fractured world. Now, one of the landscapes that's fractured is media landscape. What do we even mean by media today? We have established media outlets that are, originated in the print world that are now surviving essentially the digital world. But then we also have social media, and then we have disinformation. We have Moscow, for example, seeding disinformation